Our third guest is James M. Marsh. Jim Marsh is a native of northwestern Pennsylvania, the town of Brookville, where he graduated from high school. Jim Marsh, at the end of the war, wished to study the law. But you'll notice I haven't mentioned his college education because he didn't have one. He'd gone to the University of Life, and he had learned a vast amount from more than a decade in the University of Life, but he'd never gone to a college. And so it actually took a special petition and permission of the bar to let him enroll in law school at Temple University in Philadelphia, where Jim was an evening student while juggling responsibilities, work, and family during the day. He was a tremendous success as a student at Temple, and in his second year as an editor of the Temple Law Quarterly, developed an interest in the Nuremberg trial proceeding, which had begun with Jackson as the chief American prosecutor, and noted that although the popular press was doing a significant job reporting Nuremberg, the legal press, legal publications, legal academia generally, weren't comparably performing. And so Jim Marsh, with a combination of foresight and chutzpah, wrote a letter to Robert H. Jackson at Nuremberg and told him what he'd observed and offered to publish Nuremberg-related materials in the Temple Law Quarterly. Jackson responded affirmatively, and so a series of issues in that journal, which Jim came to be the editor-in-chief of in the following year, published the full range of Nuremberg documents, from the appointment in Jackson's initial report to Truman, to the London Agreement, and on through the work till the closing report to Truman. At the end of all that, Robert Jackson is back on the Supreme Court, and Jim Marsh is graduating from law school, and he arranged to meet this man who had become, remove his pen pal and his hero, and went down to Washington, and while there, had one more moment of chutzpah and vision, and said, I would be very interested in being your law clerk. Robert Jackson clearly liked this kid a lot, and didn't say no, but needed to think about it. He told him to see if he could get some letters of recommendation, and Jim Marsh then triggered a letter-writing campaign that would knock your socks off, and it's in the Library of Congress. And as he commented today, he's read these letters in subsequent years. He claims not to recognize the guy, but it's a wonderful portrait of an extraordinarily accomplished person, despite the absence of a college degree. And so it took an evaluation process and a second meeting, but in the spring of 1947, Robert Jackson offered the job to Jim Marsh, who then promptly accepted and graduating from law school, moved himself and his young family to Washington and began to clerk for Jackson. A year was followed by an offer by Jackson to stay a second year, and so Jim was with Jackson from the summer of '47 until the summer of '49, 2 years as a clerk of that man. It's a pleasure to welcome Jim Marsh this evening. I've introduced Jim before telling the rest of his story because at the risk of maybe breaking my time limit, I've got a couple more minutes that build at this point. Jim Marsh returned to Philadelphia, entered private practice, was a great success, specializing in appellate litigation. He's a quick thinker, he's a quick pen, he's a witty guy, he's a brilliant writer, and was a great success in his private practice. He also regularly undertook public sector assignments for the Pennsylvania court system. He was on Attorney General Robert Kennedy's commission that resulted in the first creation of federal public defenders in the early 1960s. And by the way, at the time he was going down to justice and meeting with Bob Kennedy. Bob Kennedy worked in Bob Jackson's old office and lived in Bob Jackson's old house, Hickory Hill. So there must have been a Jackson aura and echo that struck Jim at that time period. Jim is here tonight with his family, and it's a pleasure to introduce them. I'll begin with his children. He's here with his daughters, Michelle and Fran, and his son, Jim Jr. I'm pleased to introduce them. And I'm also pleased to note that in the summer of 1942, Soldier Marsh, when Robert Jackson had only been on the court a year, got hitched. And 60 years later, he's accompanied tonight by his wife Antoinette, who it's a very great pleasure to introduce. gentlemen knew Robert Jackson in an intimate setting where all of him, his talent, his writing, his values, his character, were on display to them as few people ever got to see and know him, and that's what they related today. But they are also, in a larger sense, biographical of Robert H. Jackson. And I'd like to close by adding one more anecdote, maybe not even one that Jim Marsh knows. The hiring process by which Robert Jackson found his law clerks was quirky. Many justices had a picker or a feeder, a professor at a school who would send them a law clerk. Robert Jackson would go with an individual system that was sort of built on trust and relationship. Some of his early clerks came with the imprimatur of his own son, the Uber clerk, as I mentioned, whose advice he really leaned on throughout his life and valued to a great degree. But Robert Jackson was not just a blue chip talent, as you know. He was a great legal talent, but he was not a guy with awesome formal credentials. He never went to college. He went to Albany Law School for 1 year, covered 2 years of course material, but got to the law by apprenticing with a lawyer. He worked his way up, becoming the lawyer in Jamestown, but starting as the outsider lawyer in Jamestown. And what he found in his law clerks over his 13 years in the Supreme Court was a succession of young people who in different ways were him. That hit me like a hammer today as I sat there. I never got to meet Robert Jackson. I'm 7 years late on the birth date and so forth. And so the words, the witnesses, the colleagues are as close as I and we are able to get. But to sort of meet the law clerks and correlate it with what clicked in them for him is to know him in a powerful way. Which brings me to a document. Historians love documents, and this is one of my favorites. This document, written by Robert Jackson, is a photocopy of a piece of yellow legal paper, sideways, as you see. And it's a series of columns. Name, public service, college, religion, etc., experience, and then the last column doesn't even have a heading, but has some notes. And then it's got the names of 5 gentlemen who were the clerkship candidates he was evaluating in the spring of 1947. And I'll not tell you all of them, but one of them was clerking for Judge Stevens at the time, a prominent federal appellate judge. He was a graduate of George Washington University and Catholic law schools. He had some administrative experience. Another fellow was from Jamestown. He hadn't served a judge previously, but he'd been in the Navy. He'd had some scholarly achievements and so forth, and that's noted on the chart. A third fellow, Arlen Adams actually is his name, was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, a naval officer, editor-in-chief of the Penn Law Review, second in his class. Arlen Adams twice finished second, once with Nixon in the White House and once with Ford in the White House for a Supreme Court appointment himself, and went on to a very distinguished career as a judge in the Third Circuit, where I was a law clerk to one of his colleagues. And he's on this list. Another person, Arthur von Maren, was at the time Jackson made these notes, clerking for Learned Hand of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He was by ethnicity German. There's not much more you need to say about von Maren. An incredible talent, a brilliant guy, later a professor at Harvard Law School, a man who made a deep, significant mark in the legal academy. And the 5th name on the list is Marsh. Prior service, the column is blank. Religion, etc., the column is blank. Experience, the column is blank. College is the only column in the Marsh row that has an entry. And all it says there is none. Now here's the best part. This is a score sheet, right? Sometimes you have to tally up the score. And there are 3 numbers in circles. Carlson, the Jamestown boy, finished 3rd. Von Maren finished 2nd. And next to Marsh's name it says 1. It has a circle around it. And that's Robert H. Jackson.